Hi, everybody, and great job on the competitive markets section, where we learned about the important characteristics of a competitive market and the firms in competitive markets. The key thing here, remember, was that we saw that firms are price takers and have no market power or ability to influence price on their own in the competitive market structure. We differentiated between the short run and the long run, and we found that in the long run, with free entry and exit, that firms earned zero economic profit in a competitive market. We also discussed how the competitive market is efficient, where we have price equal to marginal cost, and in the long run, we have price equal to the minimum of average total cost. Really great job with the discussion question this week. I must say, I was really pleased with how active people were in those discussions. Just a couple of things that I want to recap from what was going on there. First, it's interesting how many of you found that the model for a competitive market did accurately depict most of the markets that you encounter in your daily lives. I think we saw that exactly how you define a market is important in terms of how competitive or uncompetitive it might be. I think we also saw that while the model for a competitive market doesn't always fit perfectly, sometimes it's close enough to be a good approximation, and nonetheless, it will always serve as a useful benchmark, kind of this best case scenario in which we can analyze or compare other market structures. I do think we should be careful and recognize that we were learning about what's technically known as a perfectly competitive market. So again, it's this kind of best case scenario. It's a theoretical model. What I want to mention is that I think it's important to differentiate between competition or competitiveness and the perfectly competitive market. Um, Most people, just about everyone, in coming up with their examples, understandably, I think, were focusing on how many substitutes were available, and of course, perfect goods in competitive markets tend to have many substitutes available for them. And while most of you focused on the substitutability aspect, I do just want to emphasize again that I would say what's probably even more important is this pricing power or lack thereof for firms in competitive markets. It's that inability to influence price on their own as an individual firm that really distinguishes a competitive market from other market structures. Um, Overall, groups 1 and 6 had some really strong discussions going on, but again, all the groups really did a great job this week. Some particular examples: eggs, tire repair, bottled water, and gym memberships were all examples that I thought were helpful, and I enjoyed reading about. Many of you mentioned toilet paper, understandably, I think, as a recent example. Other just nice points that were made throughout the discussions. Um, One of you made an important point about how advertising and the existence of brand names usually isn't going to be seen in at least a perfectly competitive market. Um, Someone made a really good point about entry and exit being free. It isn't so much about fees having to be paid. It's more about power and laws that are in place that make entry or exit into a market difficult. Someone made a good point about Burger King and McDonald's not being homogeneous, but similar. And again, technically speaking, in the model for a competitive market, those goods are homogeneous. Most people would say a Whopper and a Big Mac are alike, but certainly not perfect substitutes for one another. One of you mentioned your own landscaping business, and how you negotiate prices, which I just thought was interesting in that we see perhaps you have a bit of market power yourself. As we assume firms in a competitive market have no ability on their own to influence prices. A couple of you raised the really great question about how the current crisis with the coronavirus is maybe impacting our model for a competitive market, or what the implications would be. I don't have a great answer necessarily to this question, but I do think that perhaps it's pointing to the fact that in these times of severe crisis, the allocation method, or the allocation that the market produces is not always best, or can leave us lacking. What I'm basically saying here is, for example, with toilet paper, we see that when this crisis hit, the market did a really terrible job allocating this scarce resource. Just about nobody, could get their hands on any of this toilet paper. So perhaps in these times of crisis, the market mechanism, as a means of allocating resources, may not always give us what we really need as a society as a whole. Last thing just to point out with the group discussion questions is, by no means do you always have to agree with one another. And I think sometimes the most interesting discussions and conversations can be had when a question is posed, or we may disagree about a particular point. Okay, this week we're going to be learning about monopoly market structures. This can really be thought of as kind of the other end of the spectrum of market structure, with competitive markets being on the one end and monopoly being on the other. Here we will see a firm that definitely has some market power, and we'll find that the market outcome will not be efficient as it was in the competitive case. And once we have an understanding of the two ends of the market structure spectrum, I think we'll be much more equipped to analyze those market forms which fall in between, which actually probably are the types of markets that we encounter most in our everyday lives. The ones that fall somewhere in between perfectly competitive and monopoly. All right. Lastly, I just want to point out that the PowerPoint slides are narrated. I don't know how many people did or didn't notice that, but they are. Please let me know if you have any issues reaching me via Zoom, which is what I'm using for office hours. I'm new to Zoom myself, so just let me know if you're having any issues there. Exam 2 will take place at the end of next week, so please be sure to keep that on your radar, and let me know if you have any questions at all while going through the material this week, and keep up the great work. I'll see you guys online.